All right. So, uh, like we were just joking about, let's let's introduce each other. So, I'm this is Ryan Meeks, and what do I know about Ryan? So the skeleton of a story would be something like this. When Ryan was pretty young, he started what would become a megachurch. And if I have the details correct or correct enough, um, your dad's a pastor, and you even had some mentors maybe in his circle that were like, "This guy, he's got it, and we'll help you. uh, we'll set you up. We'll cheer you on in some way." And it worked. And it worked in an area of the world in the Pacific Northwest, outside suburbs of Seattle, which I always assumed Seattle was like everyone there listened to Pearl Jam and um, was totally green. And but it turns out it's a little more complicated than that, maybe, especially in the suburbs. I mean, it's just, would you say it's a place of transplants? I mean, it kind of strikes me
Yes.
that way. It's a place of transplants, and many of these people came from the Midwest, maybe. But that's a guess I have. So yeah, so Ryan started a mega church, and it worked, and it was really mega, in my opinion. Whatever, I mean, meaning a lot of people came, and you did a lot of creative and interesting things, like pushing on certain aspects of social justice and global world engagement, like water in parts of the world that need water. And you were a kind of leader that led with a lot of enthusiasm, and were a kind of magnet slash father to many people who were looking to church as a kind of family, even a mega church. And it is surprisingly, it is that people think, no way, it's too big. I disagree. It can very much feel like a family for people. Um, and then something happened, and the trajectory started to not look like an evangelical megachurch pastor. And you always struck me as sort of a philosophically oriented person, maybe more than me in terms of interest in philosophy and ideas. And you started following those ideas down paths that were going to eventually cause you problems, only one of which made you mini famous, which is you decided at a certain point, this is getting long, this is a long introduction. You decided at a certain point, enough is enough with LGBT stuff. We're going to be a totally open and affirming church. And it just cracked the thing. Maybe it was already cracking, you could say, but it just cracked the thing, the systems. What is holding it together? What the hell is the Bible? Why are any of us here? Who is this guy? Is he a heretic? On and on. And somehow your church is called Eastlake. It survived all that. But you didn't survive in maintaining the role you had. Eventually, you found your way out of there. Um, and I could fill in a lot of other details, and I'm only just focusing on, I guess, the church piece, because the other side is that I got to know you just as a person, not as like a mega church pastor, and at a vulnerable time in your life. And it was a vulnerable time in my life too. We got to know each other, and I got to be a person in your orbit when you had cancer. So
Mm.
that's the Ryan Meeks that I've gotten to know. Besides the skeleton of what it looks like from the outside. That's maybe a better way of saying it. What your quote journey looks like from the outside, peering in. I didn't really see you ever in everything I just described. So
Yeah, we
that's
came
my
into each other's
introduction.
lives in a unique time for sure. All
Yeah.
right, so I get to take a stab at this then.
Yes, you do.
Okay, Kent Thelonious Dobson. What is your middle name?
My middle name is Edward, which is very kingly.
Edward.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, that is royal. All right, so as this plane goes overhead, Kent Dobson, interestingly enough, his father was also a pastor. We both had mega church pastor fathers, which is interesting. And like myself, found himself at a young age a part of one of the most influential churches of the last few decades in America, and some would say even the world. And really on the ground floor of this idea of reimagining what church could be and what it looked like to open the scriptures and try to relate it to folks who had pretty much been disenfranchised from the whole idea of I don't know, a very United States version of white Jesus. And even though it was many years before we ran into one another, I think it's interesting that that church was already having an impact on my own journey. And so Kent spent a number of years in various leadership roles, starting as the music guy, leading those praise tunes.
Put your hands together.
Come on, church. And and I imagine, and of course I know some of these details, but just grew as a person and as a leader, because the growth was absolutely overwhelming, maybe you could say. I mean, what you guys had to grapple with at that stage was immense. But eventually, just feeling really called into a deeper personal journey, and through some relationships, he found himself in Israel. And Kent has spent a lot of time teaching in various settings, but in Israel, really was a large turning point. And in some ways, you could say that, based on my understanding, that Kent went there to really establish his faith in a deeper way. And much like me, the fantastic ride down the slippery slope starts in unexpected places. And he had to climb all the way up to the top of Mount Sinai to begin his ultimate descent down into, I don't know, as onto a vast plain, perhaps, in Rilke's words. And after some transition at the church that he had been a part of, after teaching as a role in schools, was it public? It was private schools.
Private
I think
schools,
you're teaching in some private schools. Ended up being offered the teaching pastor position at that very church that he helped start, and it seemed like a good transition and an opportunity for him to be innovative, and so he jumped into that. And I think it was only 2 years into that experience that we ended up 4 years. Yeah, 4
No,
years into that.
I thought. No, you're right. 2 years into
two,
that
right?
experience, we
Yeah,
yeah,
we
right.
connected. So, so two, I don't know what the word would be. Two very confused, disabused megachurch pastors who, with one foot out the door, meet in a bar or wherever we met.
Yeah.
in San Marco, Florida, maybe, or Marco Island. That's what it was.
Marco Island, yeah, by a pool.
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, by a pool at a I don't know, an Episcopal church with Brian McLaren or something like that. But yeah, and in a lot of ways, just as we started to hang out one-on-one was right when you were on your way out. And I think I was at your second to last weekend before you announced that you were going to be transitioning. I remember we were at a restaurant somewhere out there in Grand Rapids, maybe even Ada or something like that. Some little strip mall burger joint or something. And just over beers, we were just looking at each other going, "Are you done? I'm feeling so done." And a friendship was formed.
Totally.
The two guys who were going nowhere, or at least didn't know where we were headed next, bonded over this just real felt sense of, this is no longer working for me. I wish it would, because on paper or whatever, it does work. We have influence and people who look to us for guidance and all the rest of it, and large churches and And yet there's just something at the level of, I guess, soul that was just like, it just had to shake this whole thing off. And I remember I listened to your farewell talk. I think I was on a trip in Nashville, Tennessee, and I remember I have a bunch of friends with me at the time. We're in this hotel room, and I'm listening on in headphones, and I'm laughing so much, like, and I'm exclaiming over and over, like, "Oh my God, yes!" Because of the things you're saying. I'm like, he did it. I think you said something about, "Don't worry, guys, I'm not leaving tomorrow. I'll load up a T-shirt cannon of sermons and just pump them out here before I leave." And I was just like, "Oh, damn it, he beat me to it," And it was a moment I'll never forget. Just being like, okay, and I think it took me another few years before I could really get honest with myself, or find within me the courage, perhaps, to realize that I wasn't coming back.
Mm, yeah.
This journey out was coming to a close, and so just really grateful we've been able to connect. And after you left Mars, having you out to Eastlake multiple times, and really became a part of the teaching team, and we got to lead all these wilderness excursions together, helping people connect with their wholeness and nature-based practices. Yeah, just so grateful for all the
Yeah.
time we've gotten to share. And it's been a
Me too.
bummer this year because of all this pandemic madness. We haven't been able to do that this year. So I was just reflecting to a friend just this morning that that's one of my big griefs of 2020. I haven't been able to see my buddy Kent.
Yeah, me
So it's
too,
good to see
honestly.
you.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I'm already starting to look at next year, hopefully, in terms of wilderness experiences. I think a surprise in my life, maybe this is not a surprise for you, but um, I like teaching. I enjoy teaching. I can do it in all kinds of settings. And
Hmm.
one of the things I probably would have said of myself back in megachurch land is that I don't really care for meeting with people one on one or in these kind of smaller settings. I think if I, as I reflect on it now, it's probably because I had no idea who I was. So
Mm.
if I don't know who I am, it's a much more scary situation to sit with someone in a very honest, forthright, vulnerable way. But that's the funny thing is, as soon as I left church, it's like that's been the most compelling and interesting part of my life.
Yeah.
Meeting with people, taking people out to wild places, talking honestly about meaning, and personal struggles. And anyway, it's and I actually learned a lot from you just in terms of how to be with people and how to be with small groups of people, and
Mm.
how to be with people in a loving and fierce way. And that's an interesting combination to me. It's like
Mm.
it's one thing to be just loving, like, oh, I accept, you just as you are, which is needed. And it's quite another thing to also be fierce and say, and you need to change your life. and
Yeah.
and I don't know, I've learned a lot from you in that respect, working together in these
Mm.
kind of in these wild places with people.
Mm.
Um, yeah, so that was pretty good. That was a pretty good introduction.
Yeah.
It's,
Yeah. We did it. We nailed it.
we did. Podcast closed. Um, so I guess my feeling is uh, maybe I think I'd like to ask the question for us to maybe muse on the question. What what were you following um,
Mm.
that would that was compelling enough and also maybe scary enough, because both of us were dragging our feet for various reasons. But what were you
Mm.
following that would compel you to leave such in a way, a cush job? I mean, it's not cush. I mean, anyone who's a pastor knows it's actually not. It's very hard. Um,
Yeah.
but on paper, people would say, like you said before, on paper, hey, you get paid well, you have a flexible schedule, you have a certain amount of freedoms, and God, you only talk for like an hour on Sunday anyway, or whatever
Yeah.
people assume goes on. But it was, in some respects for me, I did have a flexible schedule, and I had friends, and I had people looking out for me, and a lot of people don't have that in their work environments. And so it's not like for me, that's what was causing me the problem, my work
Yeah.
environment. So
Yeah.
anyway, to come back to the question, what kind of threads started appearing that, I don't know, pulled you in a certain direction?
Yeah. Oh man, that's a great question. I was even already thinking about it when you first asked it. Um, I think the first that instinctually, what comes to mind is just almost like the image of sandpaper. There was just this irritation. Like what I can imagine, these little hermit crabs go through when they go from shell to shell, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's just like, this doesn't fit anymore. And of course, there's in our situation, like just like you, I was in a position where I had um, a certain degree of like respect. I mean, I had started the church with my wife Michelle, and we had been there the whole time, and so there was enough of like personal sweat, blood, and relational equity in the body of the people that like you, I wasn't trying to get away from some sort of place that didn't appreciate me.
Mm-hmm.
And so in many ways that worked against me. Like I was, whatever misgivings I was having with, let's say, Christianity or just church in general, it certainly wasn't because I wasn't getting respected.
Yeah.
I mean, uh, in fact, the more I revealed of my own personal journey, the more I was eroding the level of respect I had for my congregation.
They're like, wait a
I'm like,
minute.
guys, my faith is real shaky right now. Basically, it was what I was saying over a 4-year period. And yeah, so I think that's the first thing that comes to mind is just this low level, like, this is chafing me. Like, I don't know why I have this almost like somatic rash when I go into this place, or when I open the Bible, or when I try to teach in a way that I know I should teach, should in quotes, the idea like I know the party line, that at the end it's all about Jesus and, our trust in this salvific magic act that occurred on a cross. And somehow I got to bring it home while making it fun and entertaining with stories from my life. And, I just
And
got to a point where that was just irritating me.
yeah.
And then another part was, because for me, I think the wheels started coming off probably about 2010, when we had a large enough congregation that I could afford a staff and we had a facility. So there was no more hiding from the irritations and the sort of split in my spirit that I was experiencing. And I'd done enough travel internationally with global relief work that I'm meeting, these beautiful Hindus and Buddhists and atheists and Muslims, and thinking to myself, I think they're okay. I don't, it
Yeah.
just felt bizarre to
Mm.
assume that I would fly from the suburbs of Seattle, from Microsoft land, to the middle of India, and somehow I needed to make them become like me. It just seemed insane.
Mm.
But coming home from those experiences just made it that much harder then to go back to teaching that we had the truth.
Mm. Yeah.
And that irritation just led me to be like, okay, at first it was a good sort of pious, committed Christian boy inside me who was like, well, there must be something I got to sort out the mess of my own faith, because, somewhere this Christianity works and I must be the problem.
Yeah. How did you do
Um,
that? I mean, how did you start? Do you mean you started like examining the tenets, the beliefs, the ideas, and your personal relationship with the ideas? Is that what
yeah.
happened? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it started with, once I realized the how evangelicalism was such a new kid on the block.
Mm.
It was just kind of like, all right, well, the sort of the fundamentalism of this particular strain of Christianity is it wore too thin, and I was kind of over that pretty quickly. But it left me without like a mooring in a sense. We weren't denominationally affiliated, and so it kind of sent me on a search for a deeper connection to a more ancient form of Christianity that felt more authentic to like sort of what I understood to be a more historical Jesus, getting away from white American Jesus or white mega church business Jesus, all that kind of
CEO,
stuff.
Jesus, my
Yeah,
CEO
Jesus
savior.
CEO. Yeah, cage fighter Jesus, which was a big thing in Seattle at that time with the other Marcel.
What?
So yeah, Mark Driscoll's whole thing about tough Jesus
Oh
is
yeah,
coming,
Jesus is a
all that
badass.
kind
Yeah.
of yeah, that kind of stuff. So that drove me to like investigate whether it was the Episcopal tradition or the Catholic tradition or Greek Orthodox, and that particular part of the journey had a long a long layover in Anabaptist theology for me. I was like,
Okay.
oh, okay, this makes sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
so give us a sentence on Anabaptist theology, particularly what you were resonating with.
First of all, can we just laugh at how difficult it is to get back into the consciousness that I was in?
Yeah.
Like giving a shit about Anabaptist theology right now. I'm like, oh my God. But what I can recall is that I loved the focus on like red letters. Like, look, supposedly Jesus is like the leader of this thing I'm supposed to be up to. And everything should be interpreted through the lens of the primary teacher. Okay. And I appreciated the nonviolence of scripture. I was tired of seeing Jesus appropriated as a reason for America to go to Kuwait or something. Yeah. And that sort of like humility and nonviolence. And as I looked around at the ways that I saw Anabaptist theology manifest itself in the world, whether it was true or not, I could see that it seemed to work in a beneficial way for the broader community of life. Since pragmatically, I was just like, even if these people are crazy, as far as their metaphysics or whatever, or their beliefs about scripture, the result is beautiful. Like I see people who are striving to live in a balanced way with the earth. I see people who are trying to, work for peace instead of buying into the myth of redemptive violence. Like I'm seeing people who are amplifying Jesus, where I was so turned off by what I saw as Paul worship in evangelicalism or even in just like the contemporary mega church, putting all scripture on an equal plane, which didn't make sense to me. I'm like, these are the words of Jesus and this is Old Testament. Like, how do we do that? Yeah. So anyway, those were some of the things that initially drew me in there. And I stayed there for a while thinking, okay, this was a much more palatable style, if you will, a way to wear Christianity that fit me a little bit better.
Yeah. Okay. So, but that's not enough to.
Yeah. Well, we still had like the issue of LGBT inclusivity, which was just so detestable to me. The way that it didn't matter whether it was Greek Orthodox or Catholic, or the Episcopals had nailed this, at least I guess in the 70s. But for the most part, all these other ancient forms were sort of riddled with their own, whether it was a low view of women or a lack of inclusivity, it just wasn't enough. It always was this wall that I couldn't get over that just felt like unnecessary limitations on this infinite experience of divine love through this person of Jesus. And I guess I've just never been, if you're into astrology, my ascendant is Scorpio and the planet Uranus is in Scorpio in the first house, which is the house of identity. So part of this is just who I am. I'm not interested in any constriction.
Yeah.
And I don't care about tradition. So anytime
that's not a good combo if you want to be a pastor. Yeah.
Exactly.
I mean,
I'm not good at following the rules.
and if you think about um, just what is a pastor, the archetype. Well,
Right.
it's actually
Yeah.
it gets a little convoluted in Protestant Christianity because maybe you have a couple different expressions, but maybe the simplest, oldest archetype is a priest, and the priest is the gatekeeper. That's what they do.
Totally.
They and
Yes.
that's not a bad thing if that's the calling, and you need gatekeepers. Otherwise, just would be a flat universe. So, all
Hmm.
right. But if you're not particularly oriented to be a gatekeeper, as I'm not either, um, that yeah, you're bound to run into trouble.
And especially like I don't want to be a gatekeeper who's protecting a pile of bullshit either. Like I can
Yeah.
like if I'm protecting the well for the community where we all are sustained by this,
Right.
spring, then that's one thing. And
Yeah.
what I started to feel like is I was just guarding the garbage,
Yeah.
and I was like, I don't, and
Yeah.
how it is like when you kind of are the hired constable of moral behavior in
Mm-hmm.
some senses. This is even more true in a small church. So my heart goes out to those guys. But people, want to like tell on one another, or they expect you to police the lives of other people as a
Yeah.
pastor, and that just got so old.
Yeah. It's gross. That's the feeling. Yeah.
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 What
So,
about you? What was your thread? Or
oh my
unless you want
God.
to
What,
continue down this road.
um, I mean, okay, this is a good question. I started, well, one thread that appeared was the alluring mirage of the historical Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And I still find it alluring. And
Yeah,
there's
absolutely.
it's a great gift to the over culture of Christianity to have to bump into the possibility of a historical Jesus who wasn't a Christian, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
that appeared on the horizon almost at the beginning of Mars Hill. And maybe the seeds were even planted by Dallas Willard, a good straight ahead evangelical, but his
Mm-hmm.
reading of the Beatitudes as descriptive rather than prescriptive. In other words, a description of a different kind of consciousness, even if he wouldn't use that language. That's the language I would use now.
Yeah.
That was attractive to me, and I was like, well, uh, what is this? I wouldn't have said this at the time, but what is this consciousness? And because
Mm-hmm.
mainstream evangelical rules and mainstream evangelical ins and outs, who's in and who's out, is not working for me. And Jesus seems to see the world differently. And so that was really attractive. I mean, that's why, like, as you said, part of the reason why I moved to Israel was in pursuit of this mirage.
Mm.
And there's a famous scholar who said, once you look down the well far enough, you see your own reflection. He's talking about what happens in the pursuit of the historical Jesus. Like, voila, imagine these fantastic scholars see a reflection of themselves in the end. And that started to disturb me. So um, the initial thread was if I could just get back to the original form. And I did a little bit of playing with more ancient traditions, even when I was at Mars Hill, I was like, God, if we could just stick to the calendar, if we could,
Yeah, right.
maybe I should preach according to what do you call it?
Lectionary.
The
Yeah, I did
lectionary.
the
Oh,
same thing. I did the
exactly.
same thing.
Yeah.
Isn't that
So
funny that we both had this impulse to find something that was deeper and richer and older as a almost like, not that it was the first step, there were many steps before that, but that is interesting. And I see
it
that as a
is.
pattern in a lot of pastors
Yeah.
who
So do I.
move
So do
out.
I. If I see an evangelical pastor saying, um, I'm going to be preaching from the lectionary, I think, oh shit, here he goes, or here she goes. Like this is.
Down the hole. Well, there's a lot of cul-de-sacs on the way that people can get stuck in, but
Yeah.
yeah, it can
And
it
it's a good
can
one.
it can
And
descend.
actually, if just to defend that for a minute,
Yeah,
one of the main critiques of evangelical Christianity is cult of personality. I
totally.
can, as the spiritual authority, take this place in whatever direction I want. And that, talk about a gross feeling. It's a horribly spiritually dark realization when you see
Mhm.
that. You're like, oh my God, okay. So just to want to appeal to something larger, I think is a good
Mhm.
intuition. And plus, I have my own views about archetypes and ancient images and how they're in the unconscious anyway. So um, in some ways, I'm still in that game of how old is this? Like I sometimes I've had a feeling recently, especially with all the contemporary news, that I don't know what era I'm living in. I don't know. I don't know if I'm in the middle of Yeats's poem about the second coming, where the the what does he say? The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity, something like that. Or if
Oh, that's
I'm,
him? I thought
yeah,
that was
that's him.
Bertrand Russell. I
No,
learned
no,
something today already. All
yeah,
right.
that's Yates. That's in the poem Second Coming.
Okay.
Is that, or am I a medieval monk right now? Or am I in a cave, you know, having, am I drawing pictures on a cave, I'm describing kind of an existential feeling. Like I don't know what
Mhm.
era I'm living in. And part of that is that I think these ancient forms and images, and even that early intuition, like I've got to ground Christianity in something older than American whiteness. I have
Mhm.
to find this thread. Otherwise, this is just a joke.
Mhm.
Is a good intuition, I think.
Yeah.
So anyway, um, that was a bit of a detour. Uh, yeah. So I think I was talking about threads. Um, but the problem with, I guess, taking a scholarly path, which is where I started to go, is that I realized I'm probably not going to be an academic. I don't have the palette for flexing with footnotes, which is
Yeah,
what
totally.
a PhD is like. Look at my footnotes. And
Yeah.
it's just not my game. It's a good game, but it's not my game. And so when I moved back from Israel, I couldn't imagine a life. I didn't have the courage to imagine something outside of evangelical Christianity. Those were all my connections, all the
Yep.
names I knew. I knew the roles. I knew when to push and exactly where the borders were. So
Mhm.
that I just lodged myself in a way, and with my fingers crossed, back into the arena of the Christianity that I knew. And
Mhm.
part of me knew this is just not going to last. And
Mhm.
eventually it didn't. But and the second thread actually comes right out of that, which was it's like I could see, I knew at a certain point there would be a convergence. I just didn't know when, and it was going to ask something of me. And I was
Mhm.
afraid it was going to ask, give all this up, which it did. So,
Yeah.
and that's why I was so resistant to it, because it's not, for me, it was not just give up a job. In fact, when I quit Mars Hill, I was not quitting my job. That was a necessary gate to go through, but something had happened prior to that. It was just, it was like a snake, I guess, shedding its skin in a way. It just that was just an element, but that
Mm.
wasn't the radical thing. It was just
Mm.
something that had to happen. And I couldn't say yes to what I would now say was the mystery or God or my own soul or something, continuing to unravel who I was and maintain this position. It just,
Mhm.
it didn't work. And I'm not saying that's true for everybody. It's probably not, but
Mhm.
for me it was. And what was being asked was something like, uh, well, first of all, it was the feeling you don't know who you are. That's what it
Mhm.
was. You have no idea who you are. And I can't very well say, hey, you're right. And also, I know who I am in this context. So leave me alone over here. It didn't work.
Yeah.
I had to go all the way through and sink into what what is kind of a kind of sweet. fog to say yes to that loss of identity, and
Mm-hmm.
to it's sweet in the sense of it feels freeing, but it's still a fog. At least that's how it was for me. It wasn't like my inbox the next day appeared with some other identity that, hey, good luck, the president has called and you're being asked to fill in the blank. I no.
Mm-hmm.
um
Yeah, that's so similar, because when I think back to, when I try to put myself back in the headspace of different seasons of this sort of slow exit, one, I never knew that's where it was headed.
mm,
And in some ways, it sounds like for both of us, at some levels, it started with this sense of like, I don't think we, and really me, know what we're talking about here. And but we know that enough, we can sprinkle enough the gospel in, these phrases that
mm,
we all know. But when you really get down to asking people to define these things, what are we really talking about? It got so abstract that it just felt like, okay, I used to have certainty, now I'm unclear. And so it drives you down a road of, let me dig down to the root here, right? Let's
mm,
ancient traditions,
yeah,
older forms of Christianity, different expressions around the world, so that I can get to something true. Once I take all the decorations off the tree, I want to see what I'm left with. And I think for me, I I think I kept hoping that every decoration I took off, I would arrive at the pure version of Christianity, or a
yeah.
pure view of Jesus. And by the time I got to the end, I realized that there was no tree under all of it,
Yeah.
at least for me. And I was like, "Oh, there's not even a tree." And I'm laughing now, but I was not laughing then. I wept
Mm,
in as many ways as you can weep, and I didn't want to lose, what I back then I thought I was losing my faith. Now I realize I lost. The way I say it to, when I coach people, especially evangelicals, is, you think you lost your faith. What you lost was a particular lexicon, or a glossary of terms
yeah.
for these experiences of unitive oneness with, you know, the universe, or whatever language you want to use there. But the point is that those words don't work anymore, but you still know what it feels like to self-transcend, and you know what it feels like to forgive, and
Mhm.
you know what it feels like to build community, and so all of these sort of values can still be there. But for, at least for me, it started with the need, to, oh, my certainty's gone, let's sit.
Mhm. Let's what?
And
It
by
it
the end, say it again.
it broke up. Certainty's gone. Let's
Yeah.
fix it. Is that what you were gonna say?
Yeah, I was like, "Oh,
Okay.
I
Yeah.
lost my certainty. We
Yeah.
don't know what we're talking about. Let's address that. Let's
Mhm.
fix that.
Mhm.
Let's
That's
solve
right.
it
That's right. Yeah.
by going to the root."
Mm.
And then you dig far enough in, and if you're really open to like reading some of these studies, you realize like, we don't really know how much of this Jesus ever actually said.
Yeah.
And because then when you're like, let's go back to Anabaptist Ryan. Anabaptist Ryan was like, well, we just need to focus on the words of Jesus, because at least
Mhm.
we know he said these things. And then you're
Yeah.
like, well, maybe not so much.
Maybe not so much.
And then you just find that like it's just harder and harder, especially megachurch, right? If you don't have some solid objective, we have the truth. Like, even if you're like, we have a lot of questions, but we know this.
Yeah.
If you don't have that nucleus,
Yeah.
it's really hard to bang the war drums of like, let's go out and, be missionaries, even in the workplace, because you're like,
Yeah.
well, we don't know if we're right. And evangelicalism has no idea what to do if it's not the people with the truth.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah. And actually, even more than beat the drums and go into the workplace, it's uh, it's keeping the thing alive financially in terms of tithes and
Totally.
gifts. Because
Yes.
if you still have that one or two points where you can say, these are non-negotiables, period, I will die on this hill, people are a
Hmm.
lot more likely to say, okay, you know, here's part of my paycheck. But when you're
Exactly.
like, I don't know, could be
Yeah.
just trying to, be a presence in the world. That's not exactly like people don't get their checkbooks out for that, as you
For
know.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember I did a this is the dumbest move. I did a talk called "Stop Tithing to the Angry God," and I remember I remember we had an elders meeting, and they were like, "That was, I mean, it was good. Maybe not the most financially helpful talk we've ever done."
Exactly.
It's
Oh
like
man.
it's just so hard. The whole model, you know, it only works insofar as you're. I mean, people are paying for a service, no matter how
Mhm.
spiritual you want to phrase it.
Yeah.
Um, People don't like living life without closure, without conclusion, without some level of certitude, and they outsource it to their pastors
Mhm.
oftentimes. At least that's my experience in evangelicalism. It's like, okay, you go on the journey. It's even more fun if you kind of have a spicy background life.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah. Exactly.
I was a pimp and a drug dealer, and then Jesus found me, and then people are like, he's amazing. And then I went to Bible college and seminary, and now I write a bunch of I'm a famous megachurch pastor, and I know these things to be true, so that they can go back and do 60-hour work weeks on Microsoft and do the rest of their stuff. And they can crack their Bible twice a year, or maybe even twice a month. And they just need you. You're the outsourced faith guy.
Mhm.
And what's really uncomfortable for people is when they realize that they've been outsourcing their faith to somebody who is actually on a journey themselves.
Yeah. It's scary. That's right. Yeah.
You're like, oh shit,
Yep.
if you don't believe anymore, I have to confront what the hell do I believe?
Yep.
And that creates chaos.
It does. And I mean, I had an elder say something similar to me, because I gave a sermon that, yeah, I don't, I should have titled it something like, "You don't need to come here." And he was like, "Hey, loved it. Just, I believe that. It's very passionate." And it does seem true. On the other hand, you can't tell people that,
Yeah,
because then they won't come here. Like, yeah,
exactly.
I mean, that's the problem with even taking the words of Jesus more seriously, you know. Yeah, I don't know if we really want to do that. I don't know if we really want to take them
Totally.
all that seriously. We want to take the ones that seriously affirm our confirmation bias. Those we'll take
Absolutely.
seriously. But other ones that are a stumbling block, this is why he ends up murdered. This is why people killed Jesus, because he is a stumbling block. And that's a
Absolutely.
hard thing to worship. It is like worshiping a massive spiritual stumbling block.
Yeah.
And worse, the language of Christianity is to love that. So
Mhm.
it's a strange paradox.
It just makes sense. You see it just plays itself out over and over again. I don't care whether it actually happened, but like, riding the donkey into Jerusalem, we want to be like, yay, save us. That's the worship impulse.
Yeah.
And when it's like this, I'm nothing that you expected or wanted.
Mhm.
I'm not going to answer any of those things.
Yeah.
I'm here to disrupt your worldview and frustrate, and I'm here to bring a sword, and I'm going to divide people, like those kinds of
Yeah. No
language.
one,
Like, you're
no
like,
one likes that.
Jesus, you're not really, who's my mother and who's my,
Yeah.
brother. It's like he has nothing to say about traditional American family values. And
I
this guy's
know.
going to be a problem. Maybe we should stick to Paul.
Yeah. Paul is, yeah, he's more technical. He's
Yeah.
entering the kind of conversation that makes sense to a Western educated
Yes,
person.
Western
Jesus
for
is
sure.
speaking like an Eastern. Oh, actually, Paul is too. I don't want to throw Paul under the bus. He does say some very mystical things. And even if you push
Sure.
Paul, which he apparently was being pushed, he won't talk about his own experience. He says, "Well, I guess I went up to the third heaven, but I can't really tell you anything about it." What is that?
Totally.
What?
Yeah,
You
because
wouldn't
we
you
couldn't
wouldn't hire
handle
that
it.
guy. If I went to apply for another megachurch job and I said, "Well, I was caught up into third heaven, but I can't really tell you about it," they would say, "We're not going to hire you. You are a freak."
Exactly.
And
What's funny is, go ahead. Go ahead.
no, you go first, but then I've got a thread to follow here.
Okay. I was just going to make the comment that I, for a long time, especially as I was headed towards, like, whatever progressive Christianity means,
Mm,
but at the very least, in some circles, it means like, oh, Paul's such a bigot, like we
yeah.
have all this judgment for Paul. And I remember in an ayahuasca ceremony that I was in, it just hit me like a ton of bricks, how much just shitty judgment, like this uber ugly liberal judgment I had for Paul.
Mm,
And for some reason, the only way I can describe it is I just had this experience of seeing how radical Paul was in the time he inhabited.
totally.
Like what an absolute like progressive is not strong enough of a word for what he was doing in the first
Mhm.
century. And it finally like hit me like if I could be half as progressive as Paul was in my own era, like
Mm,
it would be incredible. Like I'd love to be a force for reimagining what it is to be human in 2021.
yeah,
Incredible, but this judgment I had for somebody who lived in a time I can't even imagine living in, it
that's
just
right.
evaporated from me in that moment. And I just had this like, oh, my brother, what a
That's right.
guy. Like, thank you for pointing us forward.
What a gift. Yeah. I mean, I would, and the one line that was coming to me is no male or female, Jew or Gentile, slave or free. I mean,
Right.
there's not a progressive on the planet right now that's
Yeah.
posting a posting progressive that
Yeah.
has had that kind of mystical realization.
Yeah.
It
They're
just
not saying there's
sounds
no
good.
Democrat or Republican
Yeah,
these
exactly,
days.
exactly. Yeah. Totally.
They're all cocking their guns right now,
Yeah.
man. We're ready to fight.
We're all about gun control, but first let's get through this and I'm going to get
Yeah,
my concealed weapon permit.
exactly.
Um, so, okay, so here's something else that I'd like to mention, and maybe you resonate with this a bit too.
Mm,
So I was craving something, and what I was craving was experience. And
mm,
maybe I could even say I was craving a spiritual life. And what was not satisfying it was talking about a spiritual life. And
totally.
the interesting thing that happened to me, and this is not my choosing, is that as soon as I started getting more honest and saying this is not working for me, and even courageous in saying, for example, I'm not a Christian, then I started having strange, numinous, mystical, upside down experiences, caught in dreams, altered states of consciousness. In other words, a spiritual life started happening unto me. And actually, what sparked this was what you said about grief. The beginning of the end for me started with grief.
Mm,
I was at 9,000 feet in New Mexico in a kind of alpine meadow, and I was down by the river, and my intention was to do some kind of ceremony. I don't even remember what. Um, I think maybe at the time I felt like I wanted to commit myself to taking the inner journey more seriously. What happened to me is that I fell into a well of grief that I didn't know was there. And
mm,
it had such a powerful life of its own. All I could do was just surrender to the waves of laughter and tears and howling. And if you would have stopped me at the end of this and said, "What are you upset about?" I would have no idea. I mean, I had no idea. And words were insufficient. It's not like I was, well, I'm sad about my job, or my dad has a terrible disease, or even I'm not sure what to do with my life. None of that. It was just the experience of being taken. I think I might say I was grieving um, the unlived life. I don't, maybe that's what I would say,
mhm,
but, and maybe I just was in touch with the tragic and beautiful nature of life itself. I don't know, but it turned my world around. And
mhm,
that's what I mean about I started to have a spiritual life when about the same time I got so uncomfortable talking about a spiritual life.
mhm,
And then I wanted to follow that thread. I was like, nope, um, that's what I'm craving.
mhm.
Um,
That makes sense. And for sure, I mean, thankfully, one thing I'm proud of, I look back on one of my friends, Peter, he uses that phrase from Ken Wilber, which is probably one of his greatest phrases, transcend and include. as a way of moving forward, right?
Mm.
I don't need to explain that for this joke, but he said, I like to transcend and be embarrassed. Like, I
Yeah,
look back on what I used to say, some of the things I used to believe, the way I would operate, the way I would lead because of how I was trained in evangelical Christianity. And I just look back and I'm just like, oh my God, I'm just so embarrassed. But one of the things I am proud of is that I've always, as best I could at every stage of consciousness, I really did want to know God.
mm,
Like,
mm,
it
mhm.
was authentic, like for me. Like I remember, man, I even as a megachurch pastor, I never had like a cool green room to go back to, and
Oh, I did.
I like I would show up. I wouldn't just like roll up right before my sermon and do it and then head out, and like I would show up before the setup team, or like even when we had a building, I'd show up before, like about the time the people were making coffee, and I would pray over every single chair in a room where at the biggest we'd ever sat, it was like almost 2,000 seats in that
Mhm.
room, and I would pray over those things because it was nobody was in the room. Nobody was like, I wasn't trying to be pious
That's
and
right. Yeah.
cool and
Mhm,
spiritual. I wanted to know God,
mhm,
and I wanted other people to know God. And I had had enough of an experience growing up in evangelicalism. I joke about it a lot now, but there's a reason it lasted in me
mhm.
up until my basically, late 30s. I had authentic transcendent experiences with people in worship, in prayer. I had a particular, glossary of terms that I dumped on top of those experiences in order to give them texture that I could communicate. When I pull those off, I think those were authentic experiences, but I poured like, all the
Yeah.
language that fit the tribe. But that's one thing I'm thankful for is like, eventually I think it led me out, but that was the thread that actually before I even started the church was true, that I want to know. I don't want to memorize the sacred or transcendent experiences of dead people.
Yeah.
I want I want to experience them myself. I want to
Yeah.
know God. God is real.
Yep.
Then I want to know God. I want to feel God. I
Mhm,
want to make love to God. I want to do
mhm.
whatever I can do in relationship to this presence and power. Um, and I'm really, and that's still alive today. So in some ways, it's like I still have the same faith as
Yeah.
ever.
Yeah.
I'm
No, I
fucking with
believe
the
you.
tools.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly. And I actually, it's very beautiful what you're saying. It reminded me of a Rilke line. He says, "Go to the limits of your longing,"
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
that image of you praying over those chairs. And actually, even when I first got to know you, and I would come to East Lake and teach, um, you were still like that. I don't know if you were praying over each chair, but you were there and you were moving each of the chairs and making sure they're in the right place and making sure people have what they need. And I
Yeah.
mean, that's part
Yeah.
of maybe just how you lead, but there was a kind of authenticity that you always carried that also carried you. It's just, you don't know where the limits of the longing go. It's just like, but it's worth trusting. And
Mm.
I think to try to say something helpful, um, early on in the kind of thing that we're describing, which is, you can use all kinds of metaphors. When the soul starts knocking on the door of your life, let's just use that for the time being. One of the most important things you can do is try to get as authentic as you can. Even if you don't
Yes.
even know what that is, just say, follow the longing, follow it as authentically as you can, and see what unfolds. Um, Instead of maybe shrinking back. It's a courageous move, and a kind of raw possibility that I might be wrong is actually quite enlivening. It's like, all
Mm-hmm.
right, I'm gonna keep going, in this kind
Mm-hmm.
of wildly authentic way. And if I make an ass of myself, so be it. At least I wasn't pretending. You know.
Yes, that's the
Mm,
beauty of confession. Something I still think is one of the most powerful spiritual practices anyone can engage in. Is it sounds so like I guess it's freighted with a lot of like shame and bullshit church baggage,
mm,
but to bring forward what's inside
yeah.
is not only to live authentically, which of course we're all, that's a word we all throw around. We want to have authentic relationships or whatever,
Yeah.
but it's not just like, oh, it's good to live in truth. But I actually find that when I articulate what's in here,
Mhm.
I actually touch it in a deeper way. It's almost like an
Yeah.
artist, painting something. It's already in here, but it's in the process of bringing it forward that you get to behold its beauty.
Mhm.
And not to say that everything within us is beautiful necessarily, or that we'll experience it that way, but even in my experiences, holding space for people who are taking like high dose plant medicine, I like to encourage them, like, if you have the courage to verbalize what's happening in
Yeah.
the journey,
Yeah.
it will almost double the intensity. And even just yesterday, I had this experience where this person is starting to articulate the feeling. And just by saying the truth of what's happening internally, there's this massive energetic, like somatic or emotional
Mhm.
flood that comes through. And here's where all the grief, but the grief couldn't pop through until there was this confession, or
Yeah.
this
I agree.
whatever, this
Mhm.
this longing that was articulated.
Yep. Even with active imagination, which is something I use with people, sometimes. So in active imagination, where it's a bit guided, but then you drop people off and you don't know what's happening, to do a
Mm.
check-in. Like, if you're willing, could you could you take me into what's happening in your experience? And as soon as their mouth opens, the whole thing just, it's like the trap door opens. You know.
Yeah, I've
Yes.
seen you do that really well in dream work with people too.
Yeah. Yeah.
In fact, I'd say that's one of the things I appreciate most about you. I remember even when I was at your mega, I'll call it your mega church. How's that? Even with after the sermon, I was present while you interacted with a couple of different people. And what I have always appreciated about you is I just have never felt from you that you feel any pressure to bullshit about anything. Like, small talk is like, you're just not interested in it. So when people ask you a question, you're going to tell them like what you think. And that ability to, I guess what I watch when I watch you do it is, I see people ask you something, and of course you're going to respond to people who are asking actually to hear something from you. But you are good at like pausing and checking in, like, what do I mean, you even do this when you teach. You like think out loud, what am I trying to say here? And you reflect in, you check in, what's here, and then you offer as best you can, here's what's going on inside of me. And I found that that's helped me be a better just friend, or
Mm.
even parent. Like, take a pause, take that question in, and then pause for 1 second and find out, like, hey, what's really in here, and then offer that in truth. I guess I just want to say, like, I've learned a lot about how to do that from you.
Well, I mean, first, thanks for mirroring that back to me, because it's not always obvious to me that that's what's going on. And sometimes I'm doing that, and maybe sometimes it's just a persona that I'm putting out there. Like, I'm not going to
With your
bullshit with
monocle and your
you.
pipe.
Yeah, exactly. Uh, no, but I mean, that kind of internal check-in, I hope to grow into that kind of person. Um, Yeah, and I mean, okay. So two things I want to say. First, I was thinking about confession, like, just the way you framed it in such an interesting way, and also the context of plant medicine and now dreams and active imagination. And it's just so funny that people will say, "Oh, church is like, so oppressive and patriarchal, and you have to confess your sins," which they're confessing to their therapist. They're saying
Yeah.
they're bitching about church,
Yes.
and it's oppressive structures of confession, and
Yeah.
except they're paying $150 an hour for it. So yeah, there's something really important about it. The relationship between articulation and the somatic, bodily, emotional way of being. There's a link. And maybe the scriptures even have some insight in associating the divine with word. That's
Mm-hmm.
straight from Yahweh, or the Hebrew orientation. There was something about the relationship between word and what they were imagining the divine to be. So
Mm-hmm.
um Okay, so maybe let's see, what time is it? So we've been going close to an hour. Let's try to, if we can, maybe
Hmm.
say, what's the leading edge for you right now? What do you feel, maybe in your own life or more broadly in the culture? What's kind of pulling you, luring you, tugging at you? What would you say?
Hmm. There's probably a number of things. I mean, it would be hard to say at this point in our cultural moment that I'm not like concerned about some of the trends of polarization that I see.
Mhm.
You know, this inability for nuance or dialogue, this like you're with us or you're Hitler kind of a
Yeah.
mentality on both sides of the fence. That concerns me. Um, but having nodded at yes, I'm aware of all the chaos. That's not probably what's consuming my heart the most these days. Um, I guess one thing that's surprising me is how much lately I've been drawn back to some pretty basic spiritual practices that I learned growing up in Christianity. I don't hold them the same way,
Mhm.
and they're not freighted with a bunch of knowing. But in some ways, it kind of goes back to what we were saying with confession. Like I've come back to these, I would think, healthy habits that with just a slight phrasing change are just ways of being psychologically healthy and whole.
Yeah. Yeah. Like what?
And
Like what?
well, like so confession we've already talked about, but finding ways to so I'd say regulating my nervous system
Mm,
by getting close to my breath.
mm,
Um, even just in my uh, whatever we want to term our journey into ancient Christian practices. You know, there's a lot of contemplative tradition in the history of the sort of the desert fathers and mothers, where a lot of those contemplative practices have become really important to me,
yeah.
and even prayer, not in the sense of placating or laundry listing my, you know, the Christmas things I want from my Santa in the sky kind of prayer,
Mhm.
but that humble posture of recognizing that there's a frame of reality, you know, whether you want to call that a 0 point energy field or the great radiance or the everything seed or God or whatever, I don't
Yeah.
care what the name is, but to know that like there is an order to this experience that I'm having as Ryan right now.
Mm.
And you know, as you know, after cancer, I sort of whittled my whole life philosophy down to two basic things: life is a gift, love is the point. So the first movement is a movement of gratitude, and I take that into what I would now call my prayer life. Which, to be honest, dude, I went years without praying. I was just so done with,
Yeah.
you know, dear Jesus, get me into a parking space, or even something as simple as or more substantial, like heal my kid from this ailment,
Yeah.
when you know God's letting everybody 800,000 kids die of diarrhea. Like I got rid of prayer in a adolescent and brokenhearted, I would say,
Mm.
like fuck this shit. You know, the world is just this meaningless mess, and actually it's cancer and psychedelics that have brought me back into this posture of just gratitude. Like I don't have the answers, but I know there's a larger frame of reality
Mm.
out of which I emerge. And when I express gratitude, almost like it's almost like a shotgun blast. Like I don't know who this is for,
Mhm.
but thank you.
Yeah.
It orients my heart toward my experience of life in a way that lowers my blood pressure.
Yeah.
You know, it stops me from living on the stress hormones and flooding my body with cortisol, and those are all poisonous ways to be. So you know, that's just a couple examples, but
Yeah.
it's been coming back to prayer has been almost in some ways surprising. And I even told a friend I was a little bit embarrassed. Like I was like, you know, I'm actually praying a lot
Yeah.
now.
Oh, that's
Like I'm
funny.
taking drugs or something like that.
Yeah.
I started praying. I'm kind of addicted. So just praying in gratitude, and then life is a gift, love is the point is the second half. And
Yeah.
And, I see that all over, my formation in Christian spirituality, which is, what does it look like to give back from a place of abundant generosity, from that love, and finding ways to do that as a practice instead of like a do good or should type of energy.
Mm. Yeah, lovely. Amazing. Um, yeah, I mean, maybe just to turn the question on myself for a second. Um, well, first of all, I resonate with being embarrassed because, like, I'm working on a new book and it is jam full of
Mhm.
biblical verses and texts. I'm like, ooh. Or sometimes I'll make a podcast, I'm like, hey, I'm sorry that I've got to bring this up. And
Yeah.
what is that about? I'll tell you what it's not about. It's not about my um, being unable to let go of something.
Hmm.
No, actually, it's in the process of letting go of the necessity to cling to the biblical narrative as a source of identity that I begin to discover its depths and the archetypal. And all I mean is patterns, the patterns that are true, and
Hmm.
that point to a kind of psychological and spiritual way of being in the world that we ought not to be so quick to dismiss. And I'm
Hmm.
finding myself as almost a kind of defender of the ancient ways. And I'm not speaking just exclusively of Christianity or Judaism or something. I just mean the ancient ways.
Yeah.
It's so funny that I mean, from an evolutionary point of view, let's just say we're in our current form, something like 2 million years old.
Hmm.
Um, the 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 Bible and its archetypal structures came out of that being shaped from 2 million years of evolution. And
Hmm.
to think that that is old and outdated, I mean, it's like um, there's no time gap between 2021 and when somebody sat down with a parchment and wrote the Ten
Hmm.
Commandments. It's a blink of an eye.
Hmm.
So
Yes.
anyway, I do find myself in some ways resonating with the poetry that is the Bible, and that for better or worse, and sometimes for worse, is also part of the structure of the collective Western psyche. So it's like playing with fire in a fun way.
Hmm.
People, oh, I'm not
Hmm.
into the Bible. Um, that's a kind of facade. Just in the way it speaks to structures of meaning that are I guess part of the psyche. So um, so part of that is the leading edge for me. What responsibility do I have to embody and be calm and interested in what has worked, like what you're saying about prayer
Hmm.
um, and contemplation and listening and the spoken word um, and to be faithful in a way um, to some of the stories and the symbols. I think that's probably the best way to say it. Faithful
Hmm.
to what to
Yep.
what to the symbols themselves and the way they both give us meaning and mess with us, like mess with the ego structures.
Hmm.
So I feel myself doing that, which is very edgy. And in this sense, I feel like I do not belong in on the right or the left. I see the blessings and the curses of both. I
Hmm.
initially thought maybe you did too, that, oh, I'm going to leave evangelical Christianity and there's this great wide open world called progressive Christianity that's just going to welcome me with open arms. And I realized
Oh my gosh.
they're even
Yeah.
more bitter. And well, actually, I got this from Tony Jones. He said the right
Okay.
crucifies
Yeah.
other people, the left crucifies their own, and I
Yep.
found that to be the case. So
Absolutely.
I don't think it's a problem that I feel like a misfit, but it feels like all right, what does it look like to remain in this place? So that's one edge. The other edge is and continue to open my being up to the mystery,
Hmm.
like to let my life be shaped by something. this, if I can remain there, then I will die, having, tried to crack my chest open as much as I can.
Mm.
And that's hard. That's hard to do when the culture is demanding your attention. Pay attention to this tweet. Pay attention to who's not tweeting. Pay attention to just the urgency and tyranny of the impermanent is.
Yeah, the information deluge that is just constant. Absolutely. What's funny about that too is, you know, I can't remember the way you phrased it, but letting your life be shaped by the mystery, I think is how you said it.
Yeah.
What I would suggest, and I think you agree with this, but the truth is it's really bringing consciousness and a willingness to what is going to happen no matter what. Like,
yeah.
the mystery that is living us, that is breathing us, right? This, I guess, this 13.5 billion year experiment in aggregate immortality, or at least 4.5 on Earth, this aggregate immortality experiment of life in the universe, is living us. It is. And we are a ecological relationship unto ourselves, related to broader whole-ons of relationship.
Yes.
And so in some ways it's like, it's just a willingness to let go of the illusion that I'm a separate being in charge of even not, it's like,
Yeah,
I don't have a choice.
That's right.
And in some ways, that's the impulse that's good about trying to go back to maybe the ancient ways, is because more and more of us are waking up to the idea that the dream of the culture, the myth of our culture, even let's just say the small, tiny myth of America the Great,
the fantasy,
it's eroding. We're going, this story sucks.
Yeah.
It's not working on the one hand for some of us, and it's certainly not working for all of us. It's not working for the world, the way we're playing this narrative out. And so more and more of us are waking up saying, there's got to be a better story to live out, a better mythos. And so to in your case, to go back to the scriptures and be wrestling with what we just thought about yesterday, aka 2,000 years ago or something.
Yeah, exactly.
It's the same thing for me. Like, when my interest in altered states of consciousness, whether it's plant medicine or trance dance or whatever, recognizing that all cultures throughout human history, all over the world, have highly valued altered states of consciousness and sought to cultivate them, except for modern Western culture. We decide that's psychotic, that doesn't belong here, you're crazy. And then you look at, okay, well, what does a culture that calls all that stuff crazy, what does it do in the world? Well, it creates this. Here we are poisoning ourselves with our own technology. We're suffocating in our own smog. It's like, there's something about a call back to some ancient ways of being, which probably begin with ancient ways of thinking, that we have to get back to. So I applaud that. I think I love that you're going back to these old ways of thinking about reality.
Yeah, and let me just add a little nuance here. I'm also not one that sort of looks back at ancient indigenous people and puts them up on some kind of like mythic Garden of Eden status. I mean, we're talking about an evolution of consciousness. I disagree with many things in the Bible. I think indigenous people didn't do everything right, so it's more nuanced.
Pretty violent times.
Exactly. I can give you many examples, which I feel like I'll hold my tongue right now. But and maybe one other piece to that. Speaking of the ancient way, saying yes to the consciousness that this is happening unto us anyway. The ancient word for that was surrender. And that's what Islam means, to surrender. And I know, like, oh, Allah, he's a mean God or whatever. I'm talking about just the spiritual genius of what that, in our contemporary language, what's happening to the ego. It's surrender. It's surrender. It's death. And they were right on about that. All right. So I guess I want to say thanks for coming on today. And
Yeah, man. I
I
love
love
hanging
you.
out with
I
you.
love you. And
I love you too, man.
um, it's been a joy to be your friend, um, and also to learn from you. And there's nothing more exciting than seeing someone grow, you know,
Mm, mm,
and um, you've not arrived and I've not arrived. That's what I mean. I don't mean that. I just mean what a joy to see someone continue to grow and take risks, is a beautiful thing. So
mm.
um,
Thanks, man.
yeah, yeah,
Well, likewise, I'm so thankful for our friendship, and it's been, like I said, one of my big griefs of 2020 has been I had so looked forward to our quarterly hangouts and retreats and leading people together, and so for
yeah,
sure, I feel you there, and I hope for not things to go back to the way they were, but for us to enter into at least a different season where we can still see each other more regularly, man.
totally. All right. I'm pausing this recording.